Thanks, John. I'm Nason, Scholarly Communications Librarian, also a loudmouth, provocateur, super obnoxious person. And this is Jake, dream crusher, and amazing developer in equal measure. We're going to talk about starting from scratch today. So we made the decision a couple years ago, actually before I started, that we would step away from our existing repository software and move to another platform. Some of you are probably thinking, why would you do that? What is wrong with you? Maybe with the quizzical look of this charming baby. So we're going to talk a bit about the decisions that led to us moving, and then the challenges with moving to a new repository platform. I need to talk a little bit about what happened before, as much as people have sort of indicated that we should really put that behind us. It's kind of unavoidable. Starting in about 2010, we installed DSpace. Of course, lots of people are familiar with DSpace. Our DSpace repository was in many ways sort of unremarkable and typical. Lots of theses and dissertations, various other graduate student content. Some material from faculty members, sort of unique bits and pieces, and then especially because the repository had been sort of existing before it was really branded as an institutional repository, there were also sorts of odds and ends that probably wouldn't have belonged in an institutional repository in the first place, small collections from various groups, other odds and ends. And the repository was called River Run, which I've displayed with this wonderful shot of the St. John River. I call it wonderful because I took it. But one of the issues I had before I even started fully at my position at UNB Libraries was sort of the nature of that repository. And it was interesting, we had a couple conversations on Twitter about what a repository is for, and from the get-go, for me, the repository was mostly just full of citations. And I think there's utility to that, probably, but for me, it mostly just showed people that our scholars had written things but gave them no access to them. It was like a collection of paywall hits. And that was really problematic for me, and it was something that I knew I wanted to change before I really even began in my role and before we even really started talking about migrating platforms. So we decided that we would move away from DSpace, predominantly because we're not a Java shop. That's more or less the full stop as to why. Or when I asked Jake, that's the why. I think that there are probably lots of other reasons that people do it, and maybe I'll go over that in a second. But we decided to move to Islandora. We're a Drupal and PHP shop. That's where a lot of our experience lies. Jake is actually committed to core Drupal code. He's part of the Drupal community. It was something that we knew pretty well, so it made a clear path for us that it was time for us to move in that direction. I do think that there are other reasons people move. I don't know necessarily if these things had a lot to do with our reasons, but sometimes people want a little bit more control, for example. Folks might be on bpress or various other things. There are lots of reasons that people jump to Islandora, different kinds of display options, content models. I do think sometimes people jump just because they want a shiny new thing. I don't necessarily think that was the case for us, but there are lots of reasons that people do it. So anyway. We now have this lovely thing, UNB Scholar, and it's been a real slog, but we've done it. I think when we started, we expected the road would sort of look like this, very smooth sailing. For people who don't know, this is what our trail system looks like in the city that runs through. I ride through this area all the time. What the road actually ended up looking like was this. And that probably depends on the kind of bike you take on the ride. But I would argue that either way, that's not a smooth one. So we're going to talk about the challenges of moving from one repository to another. You cannot outrun the past. As much as you would like to, it is more or less impossible. I will be stuck with the specter of this thing for the rest of my life. People say, you don't have any hair, remember that mushroom cut? And I say, you shut your mouth. So too is our struggle in some ways with River Run. So when we decided to move repository platforms, our previous digital scholarship librarian had sort of made a bunch of decisions with other departments, had relationships in our library, and often people would say, well, what about that other thing? And it always came up, no matter how much we had sort of said, well, we're going in a new direction, we're doing something new. We always had to sort of wrestle with this thing. And people eventually said to me, you don't need to worry about it. It still comes up. Sometimes I say River Run accidentally at meetings years after we've stopped using it. In this way, it's possible that I have been traumatized, like you might be by this photo. So we decided when we were going to start rebuilding intentionally, we would really try to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Chief among them, I really, really wanted to get away from this citations thing, but we knew that we had some potential other problems with the way that repository was populated, with the way that content was recruited, with the way that we sort of approached some of the technical issues, and we wanted to make sure that we planned very carefully to not repeat those problems. Another big problem for us was scale. If you're a Blue Jays fan, you understand that the weight of a nation relies on a team who will probably underperform and disappoint us all. And that's kind of how I felt when mostly Jake and I were responsible for starting up a new repository with the expectations of over 750 faculty or so across 2 campuses, and many administrators and our colleagues and students and other people. Lots of people have an expectation for what they expect a repository to be, and really 2 people were building it. And that, I don't want to do a disservice. We had lots of help and other people, lots of advice, but the grunt work was Jake and I. And that's a lot of weight on your shoulders. And also understanding that Jake works as a full-time developer here at the library doing many, many other things, that when I need him for one small repository thing, that's something else that doesn't get done. So it's not 2 full-time people, it's 1 full-time person and the wizard who has maybe 10% of his day to help me solve a problem. The dream-crushing wizard. It's a theme. The other big issue with scale was content. We didn't really have a ton of it. I mean, we had our theses and dissertations. Tons of people have those. It's a totally appropriate amount of content. We had a huge senior reports collection thanks to the work that Steve Sloan had done at the Science Library. We had some faculty submissions. We had technical reports from engineering, but we really didn't have any content. And one of the issues people would always say to me is, we need to get some content in here so that people will put content in here. And that's an astoundingly frustrating premise, because I need to find people who are willing to be sort of the first against the wall. Maybe that's dramatic. But I think one of the issues for us is that there's a scale on the amount of content also. If we're going to avoid pulling in everything, we still need to find out which things have been published that are appropriate to put in. So we look at the idea of perhaps collecting CVs from people and having our copyright officers go through them. I would argue that is a tremendous case of diminishing returns. You're scavenging the past for material that people may or may not have, and in a lot of cases, even if you flag, say, a CV with 100 citations, 20 potential ones, if half of those are preprints, some faculty won't have those. And so you really are only getting a very small percentage of that content. And with 700 and something faculty, if someone said, we're going to put the entirety of the record of UNB content here, and I only want to pull out the stuff people can see, that's a huge amount of content to comb through. Another big problem was workflow. My favorite step in this is doubt yourself. You'll notice arrows point to this repeatedly. Working with as many people as we have in the library who are invested in helping put content into the repository was also a big challenge in terms of scale. So Jake is managing a lot of the technical work. I'm managing forms and workflows and trying to get everybody to play well together. We have to send content to our copyright officer, and then content has to come back. Basically, it's asynchronous work with a bunch of bottlenecks. And that's a hard thing to manage when people are sort of just passing files between computers, emails, Google spreadsheets, various odds and ends. And it makes it difficult, especially when you have a situation where maybe a bunch of people want to commit to entering content into the repository. Well, if everybody's reaching into a bucket at the same time, how do you make sure they're not trying to pull out the same thing? So the workflow situation for us is that I really didn't want to be the singular point person for putting things in the repository, but that also means we have to manage everybody else who wants to do that thing. I would argue that I have been a little bit poor at that. Expectations. I think this is the biggest situation for us in terms of challenge and managing. Number one, marketing and recruitment and your brand and promotion and. If I'm the person who's saying I don't want this to be the scholarly record, someone is going, but this should be the scholarly record. And then I argue with them about how I think that open access is more important than an advertising tool. I use this photo because sometimes when people talk about digital scholarship, they don't know how to photograph it. And I think when somebody says, we need a photo for the repository, and I go, how do you take a photo of a digital repository? And the answer is always, we put a book on a computer. I think that the major question here is who a repository is even for, why we're here. So the other day on Twitter, a bunch of people were talking about the idea of what a repository is for. And I think the biggest challenge is that, as Gillian Byrne pointed out on Twitter yesterday, is that if you ask 5 librarians what a repository is for, they will all give you a different answer. And that's true, and especially between institutions. We had an amazing presentation from Carleton yesterday about a repository that I wouldn't build, but was very, very nice. That problem exists inside of your institution too. So if I turn to a librarian and they say, well, my understanding of a repository is it does this, and I say, well, the one I'm building doesn't. That's a problem. And it's a major challenge to either sell people on what I want out of a repository or what I think is important. To me, I thought what made the most sense for our repository is to make the scholarship that happens inside of UNB available to the people of New Brunswick who don't have access to that thing. The idea of showing people collections of publications that we can already get because we're inside the walled garden, we have access to that content, is not interesting. What is interesting is making the work that happens here available to the people from this province. So that expectation of marketing and brand is one that sort of continues to come back. And I think it's one of the major challenges anybody's going to run into, either if you're starting a brand new repository or if you're moving, especially since the old repository kind of was that thing, and the one I want to build is different. Open access will change the world, probably, or whatever. This is a tough one, too, I think. While I'm talking about it, I usually put up a photo of something that provides a sense of warm fuzzies. That's what I believe open access is supposed to give you. I think a lot of people expect your repository to sort of be a game changer, that open access is going to blow the world open, and I actually think the reality is that open access is best as a service for us. Especially with the Tri-Council announcement, I was so relieved when that came through because it meant that for once an institutional repository wasn't something that was a product of the busy work of librarians who thought that this was a really cool idea, sort of like wouldn't it be great if solution, and instead solved a problem. Often repositories have features or other things that are solutions looking for problems. I would so much rather have a problem to solve, and the Tri-Council seriously solved that problem for us. So for me, I think warm fuzzies are great, and it would be so awesome if everybody published in open access. And I talk to faculty all the time who say, yeah, I would love to, but all these open access journals in my field are garbage. Fair point. I'm not going to make anybody do it. It's totally reasonable. There are lots of things in our day-to-day lives that we should do because they are good things to do that we do not do. I ate a whole pizza last night, and I know I'm not supposed to do it. Computers are magic, but they're not magic. This is a big expectation challenge, and I think we talked about this in the panel the other day, that there is a gap in technical literacy between the people who work on this stuff all the time, who are in the rabbit hole, so to speak, and the folks who you have to talk to about this technology. This is a major, major challenge for us, especially since we're running a piece of open source software, so subtext there, you control it and can do whatever you want, right, question mark. And a general sense of what the scale and time is to make those things happen. So it's not uncommon for me to be in a meeting where someone will say, it would be great if the repository did this, why can't you just do it? And I will turn to Jake and I will say, they have this amazing idea, and Jake will say, anything is possible, which is the wrong answer to give me. And then I will say, but there's a huge amount of time, right? And Jake goes, absolutely. But people don't understand that that stuff takes time. And sometimes the question or the request is a completely reasonable and understandable request that we just can't do. And sometimes the request is actually insane, and I just have to go, no. And it means that a lot of times people's expectations for where we can go with the repository or some cool thing we can do is something that we would absolutely love to do, but we just don't have infinite time. Development. So this obviously was a major, major challenge for us because we were taking on a new software stack that we didn't have a ton of experience with. Obviously Drupal was something we knew about, but there was a lot of work involved. Turnkey or latchkey. I feel very strongly about the fact that lots of people walk around and talk about the repository platforms as turnkey. More or less everyone does it. And I don't believe it's actually the case for pretty much anyone. There's always custom work. People need specifics. Repositories are really good at being general pieces of software designed to host your content, but they're not good at representing sort of the organic way in which those institutions have come together. This is especially notable when you're running across two campuses. So if you look at lots of institutional repositories, they will say Faculty of Arts and then departmental breakdowns in between. But between UNB and UNBSJ, our sister campus in St. John, you have Faculty of the Humanities and Social Sciences, Faculty of Arts. So that's no longer an option for me to sort everything by faculty, because that's going to be super confusing to users. So we needed to make a bunch of modifications just in the way we described our content. We had to make modifications in the way we collected our content. One of the things about Islandora is that it's very good at showing different types of material, but in the Scholar module, a lot of that content is under one citation model, or one content model, which is citations. So every single thing you put in a repository in Scholar and Islandora is a citation. But what if you want to display that content in a different way? How about if you want different metadata displays for different bits of content? We had to start making our own customizations to Islandora to get it to display the content that we wanted, which also meant changing the forms for that content, which is its own special problem. So even though it could have displayed things right out of the box, I would argue that nobody's repository does exactly what they want the moment you spin it up. People are always going to have to spend time doing development. Our specific issue with Scholar, again, I mentioned that the content model and Scholar should really be decoupled. This was our biggest frustration. If we had content that came in presentations, for example, it would be amazing to use Islandora's large image solution pack, but that's separate than the Scholar solution pack and the citation model that it's meant to come with. So we had to make concessions, and we would regularly find ourselves sort of going down a road and then doubling back when we realized that the sort of weight of those customizations would be something we'd have to carry quite a bit moving forward. And that brings us to the subject you've heard Jake talk about once while we're here, but you'll hear maybe more specifics, which is the subject of mitigating technical debt.
Good morning, everyone. First off, I'd like to say I'm very annoyed. Mike has stolen one of my best jokes. I will repeat it later out of spite. So, Mike and I have been working together for some time. I'm here today because he asked me to be a small part of his presentation about the reboot of this repository and present ideas towards sustainable development and technical debt. Now, this is something people throw around a lot, technical debt. If you're not familiar, it generalizes any problems that come from quick fixes or failure to plan in your technical architecture. I said it a lot previously in my other presentation, and I realized I actually didn't define it if you were unaware of what it was. And as an aside, now here comes the joke. As an aside, Mike and I think have a great working relationship, but I believe that Mike sees myself and systems in particular as creators of fanciful things, yet destroyers of worlds, much like moody wizards. So I was actually quite perceptive there, if that's how he described us. And I'm happy to wear that costume. It looks fantastic, but I think his opinion has a lot to do with the fact that over time, more and more I've become pedantic and obsessive about something I see as one of the most important roles of my job as a so-called solutions architect. I have to keep a focus on sustainability. Eternal vigilance is the price of a sustainable technical architecture. So again, although my primary role in the team is to architect and propose solutions for librarians, staff, and product owners, my responsibilities dictate that I do so while keeping in mind sustainability and trying to reduce technical debt in the project. So first, I want to outline, as a group, we felt it was important to face the reality with this repository that accruing technical debt is unavoidable in any real project. In theory, that may work, but once the rubber hits the road, that does not. So instead, we wanted to strive to minimize it, incorporate improvements when we could, and just take a more pragmatic approach, because purism never really holds up. It's best for everyone if we do this at the outset of a project, so our reboot gave us the opportunity, and just keep in mind some standards of sustainable development. So the first item is more of a thematic element rather than a standard. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to cover a lot of ground. I'm going to move fast, and I promise to make it somewhat brief. And I, again, in this presentation, want to stress that I'm not up here nattering on about unachievable standards. We're not looking down from an ivory tower. These are lessons we've learned, and perhaps something you can glean from. And this isn't a topic I can cover in a short time as part of a presentation, so instead I've chosen to kind of verbally bombard you with some steps we took that may resonate with you and cause you to investigate further. So I'd be happy to discuss any of this after the presentation or at coffee break or whatnot if you have any questions. And again, since time is short, I only have a few minutes left anyhow. I'll skip discussions around planning. That's a huge topic, and the benefits of planning are obvious. We all understand this. Mike's spoken about this already as well. So from my perspective, when choosing a repository framework, we were lucky or unlucky, unique, something. We got a second chance. Since the first time around things went so poorly for us, the project had accrued so much technical debt, we had to abandon it. So regarding the choice of repository software, this is my opinion. If you are planning an institutional repository, you should choose a product that best fits your infrastructure, technical team's experience, and needs. And if you already have a repository, which many of you do, and what I said doesn't meet the bill, ditch it. Get rid of it. I suspect you may be waiting for a sign to do so. Take this as a sign. Let my shining presence inspire you. So, for the choice of our second repository, as Mike said, we had DSpace previously. But over time, we had become a PHP and Drupal shop. Our Java experience fled. Some institutional knowledge was gone. We believed in open source. We had the resources to support it. So Islandora was the great choice for us. So I'm going to start my tale here after all my meandering. When excited team members and staff are proposing changes and needs post-installation. And that's a perfect transition into first standard I listed earlier. We must acknowledge the spectre of debt. Again, one part of my job is to keep on top of mind and remind, and usually rant and rave to our group and product owners, and now I suppose you, the true cost of technical debt. My job is to be that annoying voice repeating the same warnings every meeting and to defend against the deviations that from the standards I mentioned previously. An important thing we all recognize, I think, in the team is that the closer you stay to community-contributed code or externally maintained code on any local project, the less debt you will accrue locally. So, as Mike said, obviously there's no packages that meet your needs fully, especially in this repository world. All projects, all IT projects need extensions, custom work, and it really is unrealistic to think otherwise. The deviations we're talking about usually come from requested features, as Mike said. So when discussing these, we tried really hard to be realistic about needs and wants, because ultimately we knew that every time we developed and will maintain code locally, we both solved a problem and created a future challenge. So we're a small team, and after some hiccups in this vein early on, where we began to branch out from the Scholar module, figured we could solve every problem. suddenly we would be reminded of the maintenance burden we were taking on in doing so, and we would collapse back. So this happened several times before we finally kind of found our way back into where we are now. So our modifications to Islandora for the IR are now just essentially thematic or limited to custom forms, overriding of some hooks. No major changes that required a fork. Because we accepted we simply did not have the resources to maintain a bevy of custom features. They would be lovely, but we just couldn't do it. And the modifications we did are all available on GitHub if you're interested. And for our custom code, we embraced so-called best practices. We reused components and wrote them for reuse. We documented the components we did write. We adhered to coding standards and encouraged our team to write maintainable code. So for PHP coding standards, we live by the Drupal standards. I feel it's a good balance of pedantism and pragmatism. Additionally, for Drupal and Islandora, think about extending classes instead of writing entirely new ones. Hook forms instead of creating them from scratch. After all, just as Drupal has hooks, Islandora has its own hooks, and they've done the work already. So it makes it more maintainable, and it's less effort. Now on to tests. There's probably someone in your professional life, and she or he is constantly complaining that projects and code should have tests. And I know they're annoying people. Who has time for tests? We've got products and repositories to build. You should listen to them. I was that person on this project. And we write tests because they both reduce the creation of and self-service existing debt. Now that sounds a bit fanciful, but I'll give you two concrete examples. Writing tests makes you think critically about the design of a feature you're writing. And having tests encourages flaws in features to reveal themselves so they can be corrected before a meltdown. So we implement three primary categories or types of tests: unit tests, functional tests, and behavioral tests. What are all of these? Pradhan said a unit test tells you code is doing things right. Functional tests tell you code is doing the right things. He didn't mention behavioral, but behavioral testing mimics user experiences, so it's more like a group of functional tests. So Islandora is based on Drupal. Again, the community has developed a wonderful testing framework. There's three popular frameworks driving Drupal and Islandora tests: Simple Test, PHP Unit, and Behat. I'll speak about Behat only. Again, time is short. It's the most interesting. Essentially with Behat, as similar to Cucumber, Brian spoke about at our other presentation, you write human-readable stories. So here, in order to know the website is running, that's fairly easy to understand. They're fast tests to develop for applications, and this format lowers the barrier and encourages test writing. So it's a great entry point for testing if you're interested in jumping in. Also regarding Islandora and other types of tests, QA Dan from DGI wrote an article or GitHub wiki entry about developing unit and functional tests for Islandora. This is great. I encourage you to reference it. Getting near the end here, finally, as development continued, we tried to keep the standards high. As I said, eternal vigilance, blah, blah, blah. Avoiding technical debt should not stop at product launch, and we often have to remind ourselves, let's get back to basics here. It's easy to forget also as deadlines approach. And when bugs arose after fixing them, we wrote regression tests. We kept our new code documented, tested, and standardized. So to summarize, after that bit of a rocket ride, You might be wondering how to stop reducing your repository's technical debt. This little session may have all been new to you, but remember, we're all kind of on a continuum of learning here, so why not try implementing 1 or 2 as a starting point? You might actually see results. It might encourage the entire team, not just you. And it's going to inject more sustainability into your products, and in particular, for us, our repository. And it makes us all happier people.
I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned, sort of the takeaway from this. I think one of the major things for us is that you can't please everyone, but there's beauty in nope. This sort of speaks to Jillian, again, this is the 3rd time I've name dropped you in this presentation, that there's a yes culture in libraries where people will sort of do whatever. And I think when Jake talked about the original technical debt issue at UNB, it came from that. Can you build this? Absolutely. Here's the thing. Is it maintainable? Who knows? But you have the thing, so you must be very happy. And so I think for us, we needed to make sure that we knew exactly what our limitations were and what had to wait, what we could do right away. And for me, that meant eventually coming to terms with the fact that it was okay to say no. Instead of stressing out about all the things that we couldn't get done, it made a lot more sense to do what we planned on doing initially very well. Repositories are never finished, however. I feel like this is really definitely super important, is that lots of people take the building of an institutional repository as a one-off project. You get that thing built, now you have an institutional repository, and then you walk away from it. We're not interested in walking away from the repository. There are features we would like to add, but we would like to add them smartly and with planning and awareness. We want to make sure that we're, again, not solving not creating solutions for problems that don't exist. We really want to make sure that we do this smartly. So we had to initially figure out what we needed out of the gate and what we needed to make sure that we sort of met immediate needs. But we know that we're going to come back. There will always be evolving needs. We know that some of the needs are huge. For example, Scholar doesn't really have anything like a submission system that allows people to sort of intervene on those submissions. Lots of people have been doing this for their content recruitment. Folks submit content, and then people vet that content, and you ask faculty to fill out a minimum amount of information. We don't really have that ability in the stack that we have now, so we'll build one. And hopefully, we'll build it with the same care and craft that we've done here, and we won't put ourselves in a situation where we're maintaining something down the road that doesn't make sense. I think that we definitely learned a ton of lessons in this process, especially me sort of as a bit of a rookie librarian. This is something this has consumed my life for 3 years. When people ask me questions about the repository, I usually joke that they can find me in the fetal position underneath my desk. And it's a lot to take on because, again, everybody's expectations are so different. But I think if you expect that your repository is going to be something that you are pretty much literally shackled to for the length of an institution, or the point at which someone says repositories are stupid, let's get away from them, which I think is actually inevitable because we do that all the time, you can't let it go. And so I can't escape, just like I can't escape that photo of me with a mushroom cut and a Montreal Canadiens jersey. Sweater, sorry. Repositories are never finished. And we'll always be poking away at this work. And these lessons can be transplanted to any other project, data repositories, digital collections. These are all transferable. And the biggest thing that helped us grow, I think, was the discomfort and failure of screwing up a bunch of times. And that's going to happen, and you just need to embrace it. So I think that's it for us. We've got a little thanks slide here. Obviously, we had support from people in the library. They're listed, and I argue it's probably even more people than this. It definitely wasn't just the two of us, but we did a lot of the lifting, and these folks were all very supportive, parts of various committees. So yeah, I think that's it. Thanks for listening to us prattle on about something maybe all of you know. And we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, thanks, John. I was really surprised in your discussion of technical debt that you didn't mention one major strategy for reducing or preventing technical debt, and that is as soon as you fork the code, you've jumped into technical debt. So Have you considered making your changes part of the main trunk of the code as opposed to a fork? Other institutions might want to do the same thing you're doing. Just thought.
So I guess I kind of said that with trying to stick close to contrib code as part of my slide, but we have submitted some changes. It's difficult because our goals typically might not align with that of the overall project. And I think, especially in previous versions of Islandora, I think it may have tried to serve too many needs at once, which led to problems in itself. So I'm hesitant to send over our changes assuming they're needed when probably they really aren't. But no, great point. Yeah.
I'll do comment rather than question, which I know is a little obnoxious, but I loved the hell out of that. That was amazing. And just to your point about how it's transferable, one of the things I loved about it was that I kind of want to go back and re-listen and rewrite this for content management, content strategy, and even library services. Like, we have content debt, we've got service debt, and the things you said could be absolutely transferred to those things. So thank you. That was awesome.
I'm really relieved to discover that I have not wasted everybody's time.
Other questions? Hearing none? Anyway, thank you very much.